Hi everybody, and a big welcome to a competitive Pauper Commander deck tech video. With me today I have Ryan, also known as papapauper.
Hey there everyone, my name's Ryan. I go by papapauper on the internet and on Twitter, another part of the internet, and I am the co-host of the Common Connoisseurs, a YouTube channel dedicated to competitive Pauper Commander, along with my esteemed co-host Clay, who is also a member of the Pauper Commander Rules Committee. So thanks for having me on the show.
You're big welcome. Now normally we do like competitive commander here, but like the commander concept is very broad. We try to highlight all kinds of angles to it as well. So of course we should talk a little bit about Pauper. What is the competitive commander Pauper format?
Pauper Commander and competitive Pauper Commander share the same rule set, just like Commander and cEDH have the same rule set. The goal is to build something that is going to win the game. And we're going to do so through the most powerful means possible. Just like in cEDH, there are differences between Commander and Pauper Commander that are important to mention. But largely speaking, it's still that multiplayer format that we love, and you have to use everything at your disposal to win. Pauper Commander format is defined by a couple of key differences. One being that the commander that you have must be an uncommon, and it does not need to be a legend. So that changes the dynamic a lot. I think the numbers on that are somewhere around 1,400 commander options. Maybe it's a little bit more with the partners in the backgrounds in cEDH or in Commander, because you only have so many legends. But when you expand it to uncommons, it runs around 4,800 commander or commander pairs options. This is actually the PDH home base. This is a great place for anyone who's curious about the format to come and learn about the rules. They have articles here. They also have a great Discord server, which I recommend everybody check out. Put a link in the description below for that, as well as for those of you who are interested in the competitive side of things, I can give you a link to the Common Connoisseurs Discord channel as well.
What about the metagame? Like, what are people trying to do in this format? How does it look like?
So that's a great question. I work with Clay as my co-host, and Clay has been working really hard on this website here called cpdh.guide. And this is kind of the home base in a sense for competitive Pauper Commander. And it's a starting place for people who are interested in the format. So we have metagame stats. We have a compendium here that talks a little bit about decks that are winning a lot. And then we have resources here to talk about different places where you can get great content on competitive Pauper Commander. And so the metagame right now won't be fully represented by the data. The data is inherently incomplete, but it is a reference point that we can use. So if we go to cPDH compendium here, we'll see that there's a couple of decks that are performing really well right now. And probably to nobody's surprise, Abdel Adrian, Gorian's Ward, which is the white World Gorger dragon, but some ways better, it paired with Sword Coast Sailor, is doing very well right now. It's a white-blue flicker deck that seeks to combo off with either Peregrine Drake, Ghostly Flicker, and Archaeomancer. It's basically the ability to loop your flicker over and over, make infinite mana, flicker your Abdel until you make infinite tokens, or draw through your deck with other effects like that. Gut True Soul Zealot paired with Inspiring Leader is a Boros aggro deck. We should be clear that the combos are still very prevalent and they're still very good. But in cEDH, for example, the vast majority of decks have combos in them because they're so efficient. You have so many ways to find them, and many of them are 2-card combos. In cPDH, most of your combos are 3-card combos, and at the very minimum. And so it doesn't mean that it means that there's still a lot of them. It's probably like 35-40% of the metagame, but it's not ubiquitous like it is in cEDH. The other big difference too is that we don't really have like a robust stacks archetype. Like rule of law effects don't really exist at common. We have Eidolon of Rhetoric and Phyrexian Censor in the command zone that can offer that effect, but Creature in the command zone does not make a stacks deck. And so some of the ways that you can achieve a stacks-like impact on the game is through cards like Pestilence, Mass Edicts, Sweepers, things like that. So you're basically playing control when you play stacks in cPDH.
More counter spells in general, so to say.
Counterspells, removal, edicts, sweepers, that kind of stuff. Graveyard hate to a degree. All these things matter a lot. But you're right, there's a lot of combat damage. Combat math matters a ton in this format. 30 life points is a lot less than 40 in a sense, but it's also like relative to the number of things dealing damage.
Yeah, the games that I've played, even though you're on 30 life, it feels like they're taking their time to kill people anyways. Like, you don't punch super hard because your deck is kind of filled with various counterspells and card draw and value other things.
At common, the answers are almost always better than the threats. And that holds particularly true in cPDH. The counterspells are phenomenal. The removal is phenomenal. The sweepers are not phenomenal, but I would say that the sweepers, even though they're powered down, everything else is powered down with it. And so what that means is that in the end, the sweepers are actually pretty good.
It's kind of opposite in cEDH. The threats are more powerful than the answers, so to say.
Yeah, and that biases decks towards wanting to essentially pod race. You want to be fast, you want to be efficient. You're like Rograk, Silas type decks. And I would say, first and foremost, I am not an expert on cEDH, so I watch some of it, but I know that there are a lot of really fast decks out there that can present turns in the first 3 turns of the game pretty regularly, and they're purpose built to do that. And in cPDH, that is far more difficult. There are decks that can theoretically pull turn 1 wins. Very, very uncommon. The first 3 turns of the game, you're very unlikely to see somebody win. The average turn length in Pauper Commander is just around 9 to 10 turns. Unlike Commander and maybe even cEDH, every archetype is viable. I think it's hard when people have 40 life and there's 4 players at the table to kill 3 of them through combat damage. And so you're going to tend to have like your Timida Crom decks are really ultimately like mid-range decks that can like beat you down while generating card advantage and having combos. Whereas in competitive Pauper Commander, a gut player, uninterrupted, can deal 30 damage on turn 5. Here's a little breakdown of the colors as well. This is maybe a little less relevant, but Simic is definitely something we see a lot of in terms of color pairs that do really well. You have Tatiova Benthic Druid, which is, I'm told, is like a 7 out of 10, maybe an 8 out of 10 power level in a cEDH context. You know, it's not quite there. It's not fast enough probably, but in cPDH, Tatiova, Gretchen Titchwillow, Layweaver, Loreweaver, Parcel Beast. These are all really powerful combo decks. There's even some kind of niche stuff that's coming around, like Tainted Observer, which actually does stuff with Proliferate and Infect. Kind of operates a bit like a combo deck that can play a late game. And then we have Boros, which is going to be carried a lot by that Gut deck. Sees a lot of play. Gut Trussel Zealot is playing a outstanding role in the format right now, in that it was really one of the first true aggro decks that wasn't reliant on its command zone as a source of commander damage. A lot of the decks that were very aggressive prior to Gut Trussel Zealot were actually aggressive because their command zones were really powerful. The delta and the power level between common and uncommon creatures is very high. And so you have cards like Sailor's Bane, for example, which are essentially a 2-mana 7/7 ward for that you can play in the command zone. Or you have Dargo, which is, you know, 7/5 trampler that you can pay for 1 that can apply a lot of pressure and kill people through commander damage. And that's kind of where a lot of the aggro decks came from, is Voltron decks. What we're seeing now is we have Gut, a true aggro deck that can really flood the board with a lot of pressure, diversify its threats, and continue to punch well above its weight class because of the evasion and the size of the tokens. When you're able to convert something like a prize statue or a Nimblewright schematic into
a 6/3.
Yeah, you can go turn 2 prize statue, turn 3 Gut, make it into 4/1, make it into a 4/1, make it into a 4/1 basically, and use the treasures to get the inspiring leader out. You can apply enormous amounts of pressure. So this is where the math comes from, that we say turn 5, if the Gut is not interacted with, they can technically kill a player if the person has no blockers.
They even have Menace.
So Rilsa Rael was printed as part of Baldur's Gate, the Commander's Legends Baldur's Gate set. And with it, they introduced a new mechanic called the Initiative. And we'll talk a little bit about the Initiative. That's really why we're playing Rilsa Rael Kingpin. But just to cover her real quick, we have a 5-mana 2/5 Death Touch. When she enters the battlefield, you take the Initiative. Whenever you attack, attacking creature is going to gain Death Touch. If you've completed a dungeon, any dungeon, that creature is also going to get +5/+0, First Strike, and Menace. So I kind of think about this trigger as like combat stims. It makes one creature every turn into an absolute monster, or the Double Abyss. Now, the Initiative is really why we play Rilsa, though. And the initiative is a dungeon, one of 4 dungeons that we now have, but it takes you into a specific dungeon called the Undercity. Dungeons function by basically every time you venture, you're going to progress into your choice of path through the city. So, for example, you can go secret entrance to forge, and if you go forge to trap, then your only option is now to go into archives. You can see that the paths lead downward. Whereas if you went forge to arena, you actually have the choice of going archives or catacombs. Now, what's different about the Undercity and the initiative is that the initiative gives you an emblem. The initiative is an emblem, just like Monarch. And the initiative, if you flip over that Undercity card, is going to read, and let me get the actual card text in front of me here. It says, whenever one or more creatures a player controls deals combat damage to you, that player takes the initiative, which makes it very much like Monarch. It's the same functioning as Monarch in that way. So it's a mechanic that you gain through the combat step. The next part of it is that whenever you take the initiative and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may venture into the Undercity. So what this means is that very similar to Monarch, right? You have a trigger that's happening every turn. The key difference is that the Monarch cannot be stacked additively. If I have a Monarch card and I play it, the other Monarch card I have is really only there so that I can regain the Monarch if somebody takes it from me, or I can just play another creature. But if I have the Monarch and I gain the Monarch again, I don't draw 2 cards. You still just draw 1 card at end step. Initiative is different. So if you have the initiative, if I play Rilsa Rael and I gain the initiative, and say I were to flicker Rilsa Rael or return her to my hand and replay it, I would advance a second time through the Undercity. And that is incredibly powerful. And it is in fact what led initiative to basically mostly being banned from 60 card Pauper, and also having its most busted versions banned in Legacy. The ability to additively repeatedly gain it is really powerful. So the first thing that you're going to note is that the secret entrances allow us to fetch up a basic land card. It cannot be like overstated how enormously important it is that we always hit our land drops in this deck. Guaranteeing that 6th land drop in a sense, or maybe our 4th land drop if we have a mana rock, adds a lot of consistency to our game plan. If we're really hurting for action, we can always go down the Lost Well and the Stash. But generally speaking, the best pathway is to go Forge and then Arena, and then either Catacombs or Archives, depending on what's in your hand. If you have a lot of threats in play and not a lot of cards, you go Archives. If you don't have a lot of threats and you want to bolster that, you go Catacombs. Before we get into the minutia of like what all these things do, what's most important to know is that initiative is essentially a planeswalker that is an emblem. And when we're playing Rilsa Rael Kingpin, we have it in the command zone. And the reason it operates like a planeswalker is that people can basically damage your progress through it by attacking you, just like they would reduce the loyalty on a creature. When we progress through the Undercity, we gain access to increasingly powerful effects, much like you would progress towards an ultimate. And there is an ultimate on the Undercity. So the ultimate here is Throne of the Dead 3, and it is absolutely busted. Okay, this is the most disgusting thing they've ever printed on a card since like Treasure Cruise. Reveal the top 10 cards of your library, put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters and hexproof until your next turn, and shuffle your library. Okay, so
that sounds, as a cEDH player, like a very underwhelming power. However, in this format, I have a feeling it's a little bit stronger.
Yeah, that's right. So Rilsa Rael Kingpin, much like many initiative decks, is very creature heavy. We have 37 creatures in the current iteration of it, and we have a wide variety of different creatures that we can use to basically flip into play off of Throne of the Dead 3. But it's more than just about the Throne of the Dead 3. The Forge allows you to amplify small threats into larger threats. So the incentive is to play cheap, evasive creatures that we amplify with the Forge. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to hit early, hit often, and continue hitting, and then to grow those threats over the course of the game so that we end up ramping up our pressure. And then once we complete the dungeon, Rilsa is going to allow us to take those evasive threats and make them absolutely monstrous. You know, we're talking like a creature that's a 1/1 unblockable that got the Forge, is amplified by Rilsa, is hitting for 8 damage, and it has First Strike, Menace, and Death Touch. And that means that we're able to diversify our threats in a way that is really powerful. So this right here is kind of an incidental package that deck builder by the name of Praxia Mogamesh, and who works on this deck with me, has kind of been a great assistance in getting a lot of testing for it. It's something we actually stumbled upon that ended up kind of finding a way into the deck that came over time. And that was because we were playing the evolved creatures like Cloudfin Raptor and Gluttonous Slug, paired with the fact that we have the Forge and the Throne of the Dead 3 that put a lot of counters. So what we were noticing is there were a lot of counters in our games, and that we wanted a way to amplify those. Thrumming Bird does that while also being an evasive creature. One of the new ones that we got, one of the new cards that puts counters on thing that we're really excited about is Seba Cryptomancer. And it's one for a blue, 1 in a blue, 0/1 flash with backup 1, which means that when it enters the battlefield, you're going to put a +1/+1 counter on another creature. And if it's another creature, we're going to give it an ability that we have. So in this case, it's hexproof. So what Seba Cryptomancer is doing is it's protecting one of our creatures while buffing it up with a counter, and we can proliferate those counters. What's nice about the Seba Cryptomancer too is that the lack of power doesn't matter when Rilsa turns it into a 5/1. So it then becomes a hexproof 5/1 first strike menace death touch. And that's actually really, really gross. On top of the fact that we can use ninjutsu and other effects to flicker or to bring this back to our hand.
Like this one.
That's right, exactly. Mokutai Ambusher would be a great example. This might look funny, like, okay, this is like a 2-mana 3/2 lifelink. Why are we excited about this? Ninjutsu allows us to reuse our Rilsa by picking her up after she's given her combat buff, and then to redeploy her to progress through the initiative. We have a lot of ETBs in the deck as well. So one of the big themes is going to be evasion, low mana curve, counters, ETBs, and ninjas to reuse those ETBs. And this deck is kind of crazy in that there's a lot of interlocking pieces here, but the ninjutsu allows us to reuse things like Gary, which we can, very powerful, it tends to end games. It's going to allow us to reuse all sorts of manners of effect, and it's also going to give us a form of vigilance in a lot of cases. So one of the reasons we run Mokutai Ambusher is that, yes, it's a ninjutsu creature, but the lifelink paired with Rilsa's buff means we can gate 8 life a turn, which is huge.
I mean, in a format that is like sitting in Flickering Gary, I guess there's a lot of decks that is like Flickering Gary. Just having a life total means that you can go a longer game, because this really feels like a format where beatdown, like punching people, is something that's very common.
It's very good. It's very good. It's very common. Your life totals matter. You don't need to do 90 damage. You only need to probably do like 30, because people are like doing damage. There's a really important reason why ninjutsu is super important in this deck, and that is the way that first strike works with ninjutsu. So what happens is that when you first strike something, and because the text reads return an unblocked creature, an unblocked attacker you control to your hand, you can first strike and then you can ninjutsu the creature to get the combat damage trigger and basically double strike.
Mean.
It's really sick. So like if you have like a good example would be, you have maybe I've done this before where I had an Underdark Explorer. Everybody was tapped out. I gave Underdark Explorer +5/+0. He hit for 10, and then I ninjutsu'd in my Mokutai Ambusher and hit for 3, and then redeployed my initiative creature, went into the Undercity, completed the Throne of the Dead 3, and flipped a Crypt Rats into play and won the game. These mechanics that allow us to reuse things like this is super, super powerful, and the ninjutsu is huge. It's a huge part of it. Now, ninjutsu works really well with the Seba Cryptomancer too, because we're able to essentially ninjutsu this creature. We can hit with the Seba Cryptomancer, then they're holding up their removal for normal damage, and then we can ninjutsu the Seba Cryptomancer, hit with that creature, and then redeploy the Cryptomancer to protect the creature they're killing. It's a whole crazy interlocking thing. I've never played a deck that has as many interlocking pieces that make sense together as this one.
It's kind of funny because like you have a lot of mech and a lot of like mechanics and like a lot of tricks. But when you're looking at these cards, they're very like, in a cEDH standpoint, meh. Exactly.
Yeah, they're very mid or low actually.
Very bad, very bad.
Yeah.
But when
like
you
these
bring
cards, never.
Yeah, but when you bring everything down to this power level, then suddenly these meh effects kind of become kind of strong.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Context is everything.
Sabo Cryptomancer is basically 2 mana, instant speed, give one of your creatures hexproof.
And a +1/+1 counter.
And a +1/+1 counter, yeah.
You know, and one way we can look at them is we can say they're bad, you know, that these cards like would never see play in cEDH, for example. But in fact, actually, I think these are cards that just haven't found a home yet, and they haven't found a format. A lot of these
Yeah.
cards are like draft chaff. They're basically like a good way to look at Pauper Commander and competitive Pauper Commander is that it's like limited and Commander had a baby. So this is another piece of the puzzle, and this is one of the nuances of the initiative, which is that regardless of what dungeon we're in, whether it's the Lost Mine of Pandelver or the Dungeon of the Mad Mage or the Undercity, which is the dungeon that you go through when you're in the initiative, whenever you venture into the dungeon, you're going to venture further into the dungeon you're in, which means that if you venture into the dungeon when you're in the Undercity, it's the same thing as gaining the initiative. So we can do some really powerful things when we give these creatures first strike. Because what it means is that if somebody else has the initiative and we go to hit them and say we give Shortcut Seeker +5/+0, they don't want to lose 2 creatures. They can't kill it. Maybe they don't have removal for it because it's got a huge butt. This thing is going to hit them and you're going to get 2 triggers. And it's all going to happen before normal combat damage. So you're going to hit them and there's going to be 2 stacked triggers. One is the combat damage from the Shortcut Seeker. The other one is the combat damage taking the initiative back from another person. So when we do that, we're going to progress twice through it. That might mean that we can add +1/+1 counters to something, which can then be proliferated by the Thrumming Bird. We can hit somebody first strike and then arena and kill somebody, like on the stack. We can do all sorts of stuff. We could flip another initiative creature into play off of Throne of the Dead 3, which would actually mean 3 progressions. And so the venture mechanic plays a big part in it.
It feels like you're building up towards like a combo here, actually.
A little bit.
I mean, it's like a build-up, right? Because the Throne of the Dead is like really powerful effect in this very low-powered format. Because you get a big card and put 3 counters on it. Yeah, it kind of feels like you're venturing towards a combo. Very slowly, but still.
Pestilence, Crypt Rats, Evankar's Justice, Arms of Hadar, these are all names of sweepers that we play in the format. And they pair really, really well with the fact that we have initiative in the command zone. Because if the initiative is something that we can retain either by sweeping the board of threats or building up a big army of our own, then we're able to sit on the initiative for longer. This is definitely a deck I would take to a tournament. I think had I brought this to the Sanctuary cPDH Open, it would have performed just as well as my Third Path Iconoclast deck did, just because I would have been able to apply a lot more pressure, but I would have had slightly less interaction. But it's a fantastic deck. The initiative mechanic is very good. Other people are playing initiative too. And so the beauty is that sometimes you don't even need to play the initiative to get the initiative. And it plays a big role in the format. So the only other thing I wanted to mention is that initiative is widely played because it's also a combo payoff. And that's the last thing that's worth mentioning here, is that if you can infinitely flicker a creature that has the initiative, not only do you make infinite mana, but you also, because of the treasures, you can also scry to find whatever you want. You can flip as many creatures from your deck into play as you want.
I mean, you had the target player lose 5 life
and
there,
then
right?
You have that. Yeah, and then you have the trap, exactly. So you can just drain somebody out of the game.
Now that's it for us. We've showcased a few websites, and also Ryan and Clay, as mentioned, have a YouTube channel. So links to all the websites and the YouTube channel if you want to dig your brains into more Pauper Commander. Thank you, Ryan, for coming here and talking about your passion format.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being on here, Mons. I really appreciate it. Thanks for showcasing this incredible format, and I hope to see you all on the battlefield.
Take care, guys. See you around.